Hello, everybody. Welcome to the fourth and the final talk of the CCI 2021 Spring Series titled The Human Side of Cybersecurity. My name is Miloš Manic. I'm professor of computer science at VCU and director of VCU Cybersecurity Center. I'm also a CCI fellow, one of the fellows of the inaugural class of CCI fellows. I was entrusted by CCI Director, Dr. Luis de Silva, who was not able to join us at the beginning of this talk, but hopefully will join us a little bit later. I was entrusted by Luis to chair this spring series on a hot topic of humans and human factors, human side in cybersecurity. After three legends in the field, David Woods, Laurie Krainer, and John Doyle, we are bringing to you today a legend in human factors and cognitive psychology, Dr. Ron Boring. I've known Ron for a number of years while we both still had hair. And Ron was one of the researchers who actually introduced me to a field of human factors. Dr. Ronald Boring is distinguished scientist and department manager for the Human Factors and Reliability Department at Idaho National Laboratory. His research focuses on a number of key issues relative to human-computer interfaces for control rooms, human reliability analysis, human factors in nuclear power plant control room modernization, and similar. Ron has led a number of research projects for US NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for NASA, US Department of Energy, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, DoD, and Norwegian Research Council. Dr. Ron Boring is international researcher, well-traveled. Just looking at his degrees, he holds doctorate in cognitive science from Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, master's in experimental psychology from New Mexico State University, and bachelor's in experimental psychology and journal from University of Montana. He was also Fulbright graduate scholar in mid-90s at Heidelberg University. One of the things Ron is well known, among others, is the nuclear control room simulator, and you can see on this photo the image of that simulator. I would say the top US simulator. And without further ado, Ron, the microphone is yours, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Miloš. Okay, give me 1 second to share my screen here.
In the meantime, I will encourage everyone to use Q&A window for questions, not chat window. So please use Q&A window for questions. Thank you.
And just as a reminder, Miloš will facilitate any discussion since I'm in the Zoom mode, and PowerPoint and Zoom like to take over various parts of your computers competing with each other, and as a result we see very little. In case you're wondering what this talk is about, you'll have to wait a few minutes, but I will explain what a cyber concept of operations is. I think you get the idea of the human in the loop. So I am a human factors researcher, a psychologist working in human computer interaction, and then resilience. There's a hint in that title about the fact that I'm going to focus on the ability to recover from events. So without further ado, we'll do a little indulgence. So bear with me. We're going to share some memories. I'm going to start with 1984. It wasn't really that cool. For those of you who are enjoying things like Stranger Things and all these nostalgic reflections, but it certainly was nothing like the book 1984. I was a junior high school student, and I sometimes even still went by the name Ronnie, but I had this aptitude for computers. This is really when you're seeing the advent of personal computers. I'm very much dating myself here. but I really liked programming. And in my small town of Hamilton, Montana, word got around and I was enlisted to help solve the Macintosh versus IBM PC debate. And I chose for the IBM PC, and I am now a loyal Mac user, but that's neither here nor there. Now, somewhere in there, I was, on this path towards computer nerdom, and I chanced upon this book by Sherry Turkle called The Second Self. And I saved up my allowance and I bought this. I had to order it from the bookstore. This was a book that covered, Sherry Turkle is a psychoanalyst. And so she's looked at how computer programmers, various people like hackers, projected themselves into computers. And the challenge with reading this book is that I got hooked. The brain and psychology were fascinating. And so maybe I got derailed from my path as a computer scientist, and I ended up studying psychology instead. Okay, bear with me because this is relevant. Flash forward, Milos mentioned I was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Heidelberg in Germany, and I was supposed to be looking at social adjustment of Eastern Germans following reunification. Really, the project wasn't going anywhere, to be honest. If you're going to study Eastern Germans, you probably shouldn't do it in Western Germany. That was the one little mishap of that project. And I found myself more interested in architecture than in social psychology. So my interests were starting to shift a little bit from social psychology. And I spent a lot of time in bookstores. And I chanced upon this brand new book by Alan Dix and his colleagues called Human Computer Interaction. And I thought, what's this? Could my old interest in computers and psychology find a happy blend? Could this be my field? And because of this, I ended up studying human factors and eventually cognitive science. So, okay, keep going on this history here. And so really, I'm going to talk about my love affair with human-computer interaction. And there was this initial phase, really, when I chanced upon the HCI book, and everything was golden in my eyes. There's the promise of technology to change lives, all sorts of new technologies going to make things wonderful for people. And then came a little bit of a rough patch. A lot of that had to do with the internet. As the internet emerged, you started to see that there were some bad sides to this internet thing. I won't go into them, but there's a lot of bad things that were happening out there. Not least of which was the cyber world was a really dangerous place. And not only could you go and find yourself entangled in some nasty things on the internet, but you could also, it could come to you. Okay, there were vicious predators out there in the cyber world trying to do bad things to you. And so this kind of became not such a pleasant thing to think about human-computer interaction. There was a dark side to it. And then I would say the worst part of this was the revelation in the last year that we can live on Zoom, and heaven forbid that we have yet another Zoom meeting. This is probably the worst manifestation of HCI ever, but okay, we survived. We did what we needed to do in the pandemic, and we're slowly emerging from that. So what I found, though, is I've been able to rekindle some of that romance now and started to look at areas like where artificial intelligence and HCI merged together. And that's a very interesting field that holds some of that same honeymoon allure of HCI when I first stepped into it. But we still have this nasty lingering problem of the cyber world, okay, and this really dangerous thing. And so I have had a few attempts to kind of dive into that, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. I won't profess to be a cybersecurity expert by any means. I am a researcher who occasionally dabbles in cyber, but I am a human factors researcher who deals with technology, and I think that hopefully sets the stage for why this is an important topic. So let's give you a cyber worldview. Okay, so in the simplest model of the world, your cyber cast of characters, you have some good stuff, presumably that's the internet, whatever you need to do out there, and you have a user. Okay, now you'll notice there's a distance here, so obviously I'm going to fill in a few things. Now the problem is, okay, you're trying to get good stuff, and you might even be trying to contribute. It's a two-way street. I've only shown a one-way direction there. Now the problem is you have some people out there with more malicious intents. So of course you have to build some barriers. Sometimes those barriers aren't enough, and you have defenders as part of that, so cyber defenders. And thus you have the first construct of what looks like a cybersecurity model. This looks suspiciously similar to Jim Reason's Swiss cheese model, if you know it. The difference being that probably between Jim Reason's model, which is about how hazards can trickle through gaps or barriers and have bad consequences. The difference with this, and where maybe the Swiss cheese model doesn't quite fit, is that we actually need to have some of those holes. Okay, we're not trying to block out everything. We need to let information in and out. Okay, so is that a vulnerability or is that an asset? So, okay, now I indulged myself or indulged you with a little bit of my history. So approaching this, so I'm a psychologist, how can I help? There's a problem here. It seems like this is not a perfect model, and maybe there's more we can do to prevent the bad stuff from getting in, to prevent the attackers. So let's take a couple of approaches. I mentioned my early self, which is the Sherry Turkle's psychoanalytic approach. And so she was very much looking at the people involved. And so we can, of course, dissect this. We can start by looking at the attackers. And you can see, again, this is oversimplified, but a hacker is someone, or the attacker is a hacker who applies bespoke methods to cause chaos and destruction. The question is, why do they do it? What are their motives? Is it for the challenge of it? Is it because it's part of their job as an agent of a state or a corporation? Is it for a sense of justice? Okay, many different reasons there. This is not a black and white world, obviously. Okay, then we have the defender. So what do we know about them? Well, wait a minute. They are also hackers, but they also apply bespoke methods to stop chaos and destruction. And so why would they do this? Same reasons. And what we see is that the difference between the devil and the savior are pretty minute. Are they the same people, just on different sides? As a psychologist, I'm interested in psychopathology, and is it that the attacker, which seems to be our dominant image of what a hacker is it? It's one of the few fields, though, or few areas, though, where we would define people by their psychopathology, that would be the dominant example. So is it just a case of psychopathology? Is it different allegiances? Okay, things to be resolved there. We're not going to resolve it in this talk. And then, of course, there's the user, okay? And really, if we cast a simplistic view on this, we see the user as kind of this innocent bystander who gets caught up in this. So it's a person who cluelessly opens the wrong attachment, or maybe somebody who unknowingly gets targeted, or haplessly goes to the wrong part of the internet, okay? And when you look at this, it's often this view of the user as a victim. And it really gives them very little empowerment to fight back, because all of this has happened against their will or unknowingly, and they're really helpless to do anything about it. That's why we need the saviors, the defenders, the barriers, and everything else, or somebody after the fact to come and rescue it and rebuild your system that just got hacked, okay? So that's kind of an interesting model, but it's not a very satisfactory model, that we would, as users of a system, be relegated to this victim role. Okay, so back to our model, okay? Back to this idea of another approach. So I mentioned, okay, my earliest dabblings with human-computer interaction were really from the psychological approach, and then I discovered HCI. And there you're looking at what are the people doing. So if we look at the user again, we can look at different types of user. So is the user a home user? So what would be the end game of them being attacked? Well, they could be a cog in the machinery of a larger denial of service attack. They could be someone with a bank account that needs emptying, or maybe it's somebody who needs to be blackmailed or might be blackmailable. So lots of different reasons there. Okay, but that's a home user. We have other types of users. We have corporate users, okay, getting a little more interesting there, because They might be more likely to be targeted. A corporate user could be someone who is a gateway to a corporate intranet. That's very attractive. It could be someone who holds key access or knowledge. And of course, there's always, they can be somebody who can be blackmailed. That kind of fits together with this. The blackmailing becomes much more powerful when you have more at stake, right? And there are many more, but I'll talk about another case, which is the focus of most of my talk here. The user is an operator of a critical infrastructure or process control system. So this could mean anything from a factory to electric grid to a power production facility like a nuclear power plant. And so again, a little bit like the corporate user, but these are people who actually control a system of interest. If your goal is to somehow disrupt a larger scale society, not a business, not an individual, but something at the societal level, this is a really good place to start. But they're also a gateway to even bigger interconnected systems, because many of these systems, again, are chained together. So the electric production facility is, of course, chained to the grid, which is chained to distribution systems, et cetera. So there's a lot of opportunity there to disrupt and cause some mayhem. And of course, these are people who, because they have access to that, you might look for some flaws in their character, something that could be exploited. So that's more the social engineering side. Now, something else that's interesting here, a couple of observations. A user like an operator who is a gateway is actually a barrier to other users or systems, okay? And so this is not the same thing as your home user, right? A gateway user is rarely low skilled, and they're really not likely to be hapless victims. These are people who are in control, okay? They are control operators, okay? And so we don't really want to find them in that victim state where they have no control over the situation of the system that they're operating. Okay, a second observation is reflecting back on the Swiss cheese model. Doesn't that imply that attackers will actually get through sometimes, okay? The Swiss cheese model shows that there are always these holes, there's always some way to get through. And a point that I think is not always well reflected in our cyber research is that it's not necessarily the end game if an attack vector makes it through the primary defenses. So if you make it through the barrier and the defender, does that mean game over? Not necessarily, if the user is part of the line of defense. And especially the gateway user needs to be part of that line of defense. So I think what you'll find, and what I would say is most cyber research focuses on this holy trinity of the attacker, barrier, and the defender. And we should absolutely continue in that vein. Again, it's much easier to prevent than to fix. Same rule applies in medicine. For example, preventative maintenance is better than curing a problem. Okay, so that's, but the challenge here is that we have largely overlooked the user as part of cyber defense. Now, I don't want to disparage research that is out there, because there's certainly a lot of very interesting research out there, and there's a whole cottage research industry on better passwords, for example. But user cyber research goes way beyond that. It has to. And so where we start empowering users to respond to intrusions, that's where we're going. Can the user actually be an active element in defending the system? We try to keep the user out of the loop. We try to prevent it from ever happening. But if it does, what do we need to do to make this better? And so my shortest section is part 3, the Boring Cyber Manifesto. See what I did there? Little joke on my name. And there are just 2 parts of that. And the first is users should not be victims, okay? Users must be equipped with the skills and tools to recognize and stop cyber intrusion. The other part of this is that users are actually defenders. Cyber defense should not stop at the act of preventing intrusion, users are the plan B of defense in depth, okay? So think that through. That's really the gist of my talk, and I'll give you some more examples here, but that's really what I'm trying to convey today. And I'm not the first person to do this by any means, so, but I hope that I'm succinctly capturing some of that. So now let's hack into my world, which is going to be looking at operations and specifically nuclear operations. Okay, I'm going to give you a very boring slide, which is to define concept of operations. Since it is in the title of my talk, I should probably give you the benefit of knowing what that is. And at the simplest level, a concept of operation, ConOps, is a description of how a set of capabilities may be employed to achieve desired objectives or an end state, okay? Just reading that off there. Typically, this comes in the form of requirements or some sort of guiding philosophy document that's used in the design phase, but it may also be a living document that is used and updated throughout. And so in human factors, my field, it will describe things like the technologies that are part of the human system interface, so the system, the S in HSI, the roles or tasks of the users, so the human, and then the potential scenarios or contexts of use. That's the interface, the interactions that they have, okay? And so let's look at nuclear power as a specific example, and I'll just throw in a few slides here. So a typical control room in the US of a nuclear power plant, you can see the boards there. These are typically stand at the boards operation. And you have controls at the bottom, typically indicators in the middle and alarms at the top. So there's kind of this tertiary level of control and information. It's largely digital, or largely analog, excuse me, very much the opposite of largely digital, with some digital islands. And so you can see all of these are analog indicators. You can't see the controls very well because they're down lower, but you see a couple of screens here, a couple of digital screens. And these, of course, don't necessarily look like contemporary displays either. So that should give you some indication of the vintage. The operators stand at the boards, and then the control room is usually a horseshoe or L-shaped configuration, okay? And if you're looking at the crew of people there, you have reactor operators, senior reactor operators, and technical advisors. And the reactor operators are the ones who actually stand at the boards. You have an operator at the controls, you have a balance of plant operator. Typically, you have a control room supervisor, the person back here. You'll notice they're standing over a pile of procedures. And then a shift technical advisor. That shift technical advisor is helping them. And if you look at the chain of command, only the reactor operators touch the controls. The senior reactor operator sits or stands back, maintains an overview, and also reads through the procedures, and then that shift technical advisor supports them. So doing things like doing manual calculations because there aren't a lot of computers there, looking up information, verifying information. And that's kind of the team. So, and as we walk through that, one of the interesting parts of this, and I only share this with you to convey how much information flow is going back and forth. And so part of this is they have this three-way communication. So for example, the senior reactor operator reads a procedure, the reactor operator repeats back what they've understood, and the senior reactor operator acknowledges it. Or the reactor operator reports some information, the senior reactor operator confirms it, and the reactor operator acknowledges that it's been confirmed. Okay, a little bit of an interesting dialogue, but it keeps the flow of information going. And one other thing I would just say, since I've mentioned information, you know, if you're into information foraging theory, not a brand new theory, but I think there's some power in it. You can see that we might look at operators as wolves and spiders. This is the hunter and gatherer. So what does a hunter do? A hunter goes and gets information, okay? A gatherer, like a spider, waits for information to come to them. So there's an information push and pull that happens there. Information is pushed to them from alarms and the indicators, and the operators also monitor, so they go and they get information actively. So that's a little bit of what control room in a nuclear power plant looks like. It's not necessarily that different in other industries. There is kind of a common control room framework, and you mix and match some of these elements. So I mentioned and I showed you that our current control rooms are largely analog. And the nice thing about that is there's actually very limited cyber vulnerability because everything is hardwired. So you really, if you're going to try to sabotage that, it needs to be done at a local level. It needs to be an insider threat, okay? But as we start introducing more digital technology, there is the opportunity for more cyber concerns. And so digital technology, one of the most prevalent ones, this is mandated, is the safety parameter display system. This is something that goes back to the 80s. And it's just some key indicators there to help the operators maintain situational awareness. We've also introduced plant process computers. Again, these are largely historic systems. They can also be modern variants. And they include data historians, and they can help feed secondary screens to the operators. They might not be qualified values, but they can be operator aids. And now as we look at control room modernization, a necessity because we simply can't maintain or purchase equivalent equipment, the analog gear is not manufactured anymore and we're running out of stockpiles. We can kind of customize it and rebuild some of it, but really the push is we've had a digital revolution, right? And to continue to operate these plants beyond their original 40-year license, we need to modernize them. And so there's a move to modernize them, and of course that leads to the inevitable introduction of digital systems. Those are digital control or distributed control systems. And just to give you an example of an old versus a new board, this is a turbine control system. It's actually an early computer system. Looks more like an old Hewlett-Packard calculator than it does any contemporary system. And you can see how you would replace that with a screen. And you can see one of the things that happens is you take away the need for a lot of the redundant controls. And the indicators, of course, can all be represented digitally. So a lot of our bread and butter work is in this area, this very area of helping utilities and helping vendors to go from a largely analog state to a new hybrid analog digital state. And of course, there is an end state vision in place, which is that you eventually take out all the analog or almost all the analog and you have a digital representation in the control room. The fact that we use SketchUp to represent this should tell you where we are in that process. It's still something to be achieved. But we do have new nuclear power plants. And I've given you 3 representations here. And you can see that analog is out, okay? So we have, again, it doesn't look, the bottom one is probably the clearest example. You can still see that we maintain many of the roles. We can see that the operators perhaps are no longer standing, but are sitting at workstations, but we still have common overview displays so that everybody can share the same information and you work together as a team. I would point out, and this is actually very central to a point I'm making, we always show it from this angle, but always off to the side, there is a panel that looks very old-fashioned. This is analog backup. This would allow you to maneuver the plant to safety in the event of a digital compromise. Every one of these plants has it in some form, but it may not always be in the glossy brochure. Okay. So where does that put us? Okay, the US policies ensure defense in depth at plants. I'm not going to go through this, but there are various, everything from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Nuclear Energy Institute, and National Department of Homeland Security all have guidance on this. And the bottom line is the emphasis is on preventing attacks from being successful. So we're back in this model of barriers, such as air gapping and limited access to crucial systems, okay? That's the emphasis here. We're preventing it from ever happening. Amen to that. We need to make sure that we don't get intruded. We don't want to be in a compromised situation. And so I'm very confident in the measures that are in place. And I really have no lack of confidence in US nuclear power plants being safe to cyber intrusion. So don't walk away from this with great fear. But there have been incidents internationally, usually accessed via business networks that somehow also spoke to the control systems in a way that people didn't expect. And so I just threw up a few things. Chernobyl continues to haunt us in nuclear, and it was held ransom, some of the systems there. And then we've seen it in a couple of international occurrences, such as in India, and Ukraine has also had some incidents. So there have been some close calls there, and that still makes us uncomfortable. So what happens if a cyber attack is successful? Again, the model where we assume that current defenses will be successful, that works until it doesn't. So if somehow we break through, what's the plan? The Titanic was unsinkable, and we know where that got us, okay? Do we hold that line, that model of cyber defense that we will never allow anything to get through? Do we not have the backup plan, okay? And that's where I'm going with this. As you look at this, who's in control of the system? It's operators, okay? Operators, not IT, are the second line of defense. What happens now is if a cyber attack is detected, you go to immediate shutdown and you turn over those systems to IT for cleaning up. And so, but operators are the ones who are monitoring plant functions. So they're the ones who catch inconsistencies. They're the ones who can safely shut down the plant or continue operations. They're the ones who can make that call. And they're also the ones who need to alert IT. Of course, we have systems that automatically do this. But it's really the fact that they are catching these inconsistencies that's very interesting, because they have a mental model of how the plant operates. And there are cases where they will catch things that don't look right, okay? Do we equip them with the tools to rectify that situation? And so, of course, while operators have some training for cyber attack scenarios, they're not really equipped with a cyber concept of operations, which brings me now really to the final part of my talk. Any questions so far, Milos, to address, or should I keep going?
Keep going.
Perfect. So, part 5, from PsyOps to CyConOps. PsyOps is, of course, cyber operations, cybersecurity operations. And I'm going to introduce now CyberConOps. Okay, here's the same old slide, a little bit wordy, of what our definition of concept of operations was. Now I'm going to make it messy. Okay, and I'm going to redefine what we saw there. So cyber concept of operations, CyConOps, is a description how a set of operators may be employed to maintain the safety of the plant. Okay, and how do we do that? We do that with tools. So that would be operational tools. We do that with cyber monitoring, and we do that with cyber training. Okay, and so one of the real keys of this, if we were to take CyConOps in a nutshell, is this delineation between the users and protectors. And if you'll recall my original diagram, we had, you know, the holy trinity of the attackers, the barriers, and the defenders, and then we had the users over here. And we continue to maintain that, but we focus on the value of these users, okay? So the control room operators are pattern recognition experts. They are part of this human system interface. This means that they are also the ones most likely, if we don't have tools, again, we can build smart tools that can help them find this, but they're the ones who are most likely to detect when something has actually happened, when it just doesn't make sense, when this value and this value on the boards shouldn't be in that alignment. And so they are really the first line of defense to diffuse an escalation. What operators do in their day-to-day jobs is detect faults and correct them. So given sufficient trusted indications to help the operator form the right mental model of what the plant state is and what might be out of alignment, operators can continue in this role also in cyber operations. So given sufficient indications, the operators can effectively respond to cyber conditions at the plants. They can recognize them, and they should also then be enabled to respond to them. And so really what we're looking here to do is not to treat cyber faults as some anomaly beyond what the operators are conditioned to work with. We're saying cyber faults are an extreme form of a plant fault, and that remains an operational concern in addition to an IT concern. So it's the operators who are our line of defense there. And so we looked to investigate this across a couple of studies. And the first one that we looked at was a modernization on a turbine control system at a nuclear power plant. And so we looked at existing analog, vendor digital replacement, and an enhanced system. The enhanced system included something we call a computerized operator support system. What that means is it has an embedded prognostic system. So we're starting to introduce some AI, some pattern recognition systems, expert systems to guide operators on there. So we're basically enhancing the tools of diagnosis for the operators. And this was part of a larger series of studies on system overview displays. And of course, because we're researchers, we did eye tracking, and you can see, that's probably not so consequential to this talk, but you can see on the top there is the conventional analog control boards, and you can see there's a very they're scanning the boards and doing information as we introduce a traditional distributed control system, so no augmentation with prognostics. There's a lot of kind of almost tunnel effect, or sometimes called keyhole effect, where they're focusing on key parts of the information. They're not looking at the rest of the boards. And you can see then in the third case where we actually introduce this overview system that has a computerized operator support system and has prognostics, they're referencing that, and then they're going and they're verifying information. So what we see is just the fundamental scan path of how the operators are looking at the boards, monitoring the boards, changes with these three technologies. And what's very interesting is when you would think that just the simple addition of an overview display with prognostics wouldn't change things fundamentally from any other digital display, but it actually put them in this mode where it alerted them to things, and then they went and they found that information. So, okay, this is what that looks like just for fun. Again, standard turbine control system overview here, and then you have a fault warning system. And so these faults were not just cyber faults. They could also be regular faults in the system. We ran the operators through a whole series of regular types of failures that might occur. And then we also introduced cyber intrusions into that. So, and part of this was guided by a design philosophy. So, and really this is just to kind of capture all of the next slide. I'll show you some of the results, but really what we were doing here is we're assuming, if you assume that cyber can never happen, it's back to this analogy of the ship will never sink. And of course, we hope it never happens, but we do need to have life preservers for operators at the plant. And that's what we were trying to do with the COSS system, was introduce a life preserver system. And so the COSS provided these diagnostic aids to assist the operators in detecting, but also fixing the faults. And so we found that this, again, it was somewhat indifferent to whether it was a cyber or an operational fault. They were treated much the same way, and the operators were able to perform those response, that monitoring, and those control actions seamlessly, whether it was cyber or a physical fault. And so the takeaways from that initial study was we weren't trying to make the operators cyber experts. We were trying to make cyber part of operations. So they're already operating the plant. A cyber disruption is just another plant anomaly that potentially affects plant operations. Okay, so treat it like that. Treat it as an anomaly. Treat it in a way that the operators are used to working with. And then when we introduced this helper system, the COSS tool, they found it very useful in diagnosing these plant upsets. So they were successful at using it to address cyber compromises in the turbine control system. So very interesting finding. We did another study, a little larger scale with our colleagues at Sandia National Labs. And this was to look at basically operator response to cyber attacks in existing control rooms, so essentially spoofing. Now, you may ask, what vulnerability do analog boards have since there's no digital there? Well, a lot of modernization efforts are actually digitizing behind the boards. So a simpler path to modernizing is not to replace the boards, but to replace everything between the boards and the systems, okay? So instead of miles and miles of wiring, you're putting it all together on a distributed control system, and you'll have a data bus in between. And it is possible to compromise that data bus. So there's some plausibility here. Again, I won't argue that this isn't somewhat contrived, but we're looking at this. And so we didn't inform the operators that they were going to be seeing cyber faults. We gave them a whole series of faults. And in 9 cyber scenarios, the operators consistently detected what was wrong. And it was because of the inconsistency in information. That was fascinating. The mental model of the operator was strong enough to detect when information didn't align the way it was supposed to. And of course, it was an incredibly interesting study to run because the operators started almost berating us. We didn't debrief them until the end. Like, your simulator is broken. This doesn't work. This can't happen. There's no reason these values should be out of alignment this way. And in the end, in the debriefing, the power of this was seeing, oh, they caught it, okay? The anomaly detection of the operator caught what we were spoofing. So there's power in that. So let me just kind of conclude here, and then we'll turn it over to some questions. So my CyConOps conclusions. Of course, I'm a researcher, so I have to say there's not enough research on cyber operations in this context. When you look at system recovery from cyber attacks, that really remains largely the purview of information technology professionals right now. Okay, IT has to fix it. But there's a layer in between there, which is diffusing the consequence of that. So, of course, we have our holy trinity of preventing the cyber attack. And then we have, if something breaks, of course, we have a whole team that can work on recovery. But there's a layer in between here, which is the diffusion of the problem, which means preventing it from becoming a bigger problem. And I believe that's the role that the operator can play. They won't necessarily be able to repair the system, but they can safely align it. They can detect it and safely align it to bring the plant to a safe state, okay? And so really that's where that word resilience in the title comes from. So I believe operators are the key to plant resilience in the event that a cyber attack penetrates the plant's cyber defenses. Of course, we should continue to build those barriers and build a defense network. But if all else fails, can we empower the operator to play that role? And then this role really does need to be better understood through research. So we need to understand what information the operators need to do that pattern recognition to connect A and B, that something doesn't add up. We need to do more research, like we did with COSS, on what tools will help them. And then we need to see what mechanisms are available, what actions are available for diffusion and recovery that they can take. None of this is really spelled out that well. The goal, if we get to that worst case scenario that there is a penetration, the goal is to shut the plant down, yes, but that's not always the quickest and safest course of action. So there's another layer in there, and that's what I'm trying to instill here. So my take-home message, the operators, and we can broadly define that as users, or gateway users at least. The operators are part of cybersecurity, but more research is needed to enable them to perform this role effectively. Now, that's kind of a cop-out answer. Of course, we always need more research, but I hope if you hadn't thought of this crucial link, this crucial part of the operators as plan B, I hope that this will get you thinking and get you moving in this direction. Now, we need more people working on this to really solve it and come up with something, see if this is a viable concept, and see if what tools will help operators or the power users, the gateway users, to serve this role. And with that, INL is actually older than 70 years. I think we're 71 years old, but it's a beautiful slide, so I have to put it up there. So now my good friend Milos, who's received no comments or questions, has to improvise questions, and I love watching this part. I can watch him squirm now for a little bit.
Actually, you're making my job very easy today, because we are getting a lot of questions from, I will say, around the nation, around the world. We will start with Claire from Norway.
Uh-oh, not Claire from, no, I know Claire from Norway. Don't, okay, I'm kidding.
Okay.
I love Claire from Norway.
She says, thanks for a great presentation. Do you think that higher levels of automation in future plant designs and or multi-unit operations, such as small modular reactors, will create a higher risk of cyber attacks going unnoticed by operators? If so, how can CyConOps be adapted to reduce the risk for these future plants?
Okay, so as we increase the automation of plants, so we're taking that digitization one layer further, and we're actually putting the control systems largely out of the hands of the operators. I think I'm not sure this is a completely satisfactory answer, Claire. Obviously, the risk is there. I think a well-designed automation system can have checks and balances to do exactly what the operators are doing manually now. So we need to build in that pattern recognition, that mental model that figures out these two things don't belong together. The other part is, of course, what is the role of the human in all of this? And we move from a concept of operations to a concept of monitoring. And then it becomes crucial to figure out, and I don't have the answer, Claire, what information do we impart to these monitoring operators that would enable them to pick up that pattern? And what tools do we allow for manual override? Is it as simple as executing the shutdown button, or is there some other stage in between? That's really one of the variables that's in my mind. Is there ever a case where we have a cyber intrusion where it might be safe to continue operating the plant at some level? I think that's a big challenge question that I'm not prepared to answer right now. So I hope that somewhat answers it, Claire. Thanks for attending all the way from Norway.
And here's the next question from Joe. He says, outside of the world of critical infrastructure, how do you incentivize operators, workers to treat CyConOps seriously? How do you account for business managers who already push back at security measures, who see security as IT's responsibility? And I recognize you're not responsible for solving this problem, but what's your take on it?
Again, I love the dialogue, because these are things that I wouldn't necessarily think about in my own little world. The pushback, again, if you're dealing from a business standpoint, is at some point I think you need to throw in the risk models and show the consequence if we don't address it. So shutdown or failure of a plant is not an acceptable consequence, and a shutdown of a plant may not be a short-term fix either. So I believe most operators have ingrained in their DNA the safety of the system. And I think if we treat security as another form of safety, I don't think we'll be challenged by the buy-in. That's probably a little bit naive, but I think there's a path there that we could win over the skeptics on the business end, and we can also, again, win over the operators to see this as part of what they're doing, not just something to be afraid of, but something that actually enables them to do their job even better than they're doing now.
So I will skip a few questions to go to one that just came in. It comes from anonymous attendee, and
Uh-oh.
anonymous attendee says, you chose to share your desktop. Is that one example of that the human is also vulnerability in cyber?
Yes, good point. Am I still sharing it? Oh, yes, I am. I didn't want to share that. There we go. That's a human error. I actually do human error research. My desktop doesn't usually look like that. I just had a rebuild and we dumped a bunch of stuff on the desktop. So enjoy the files, the file names you saw. Yeah, it's a human error.
Another example that it's a live matter. It's a tough one. Here's another question from Adina. From a human factors perspective, how can we prevent users to be victims? How can we make users defenders? Are there best practices from human factors HCI domain? And this is a hot topic, and you touched upon it, but perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more. How can we prevent users to be victims? How can we turn users into defenders?
So I believe this is Adina, who is also a Carleton University graduate. So hello, Adina. Again, I would harken back to, I think there's a lot of examples of this in the domain of safety HCI. So how do we equip operators to recover from mishaps? Mishaps like sharing my screen. Okay, that's a low consequence, probably. I don't think I put my bank account information there. And so, again, I don't have a roadmap for every scenario. Adina, I think part of this talk is to get people figuring this out, thinking about this, and what this would look like. So unsatisfactory answer, Adina, but thanks for thanks for thinking about it. And again, the key is safety HCI. A lot of our HCI work is really done towards, in the research community, just on the power of HCI. In the consumer world, of course, it's about usability. And this is not a usability question. This is a safety question. Our end goal is, how can we make the system secure and safe? And so the kind of checks and balances, for example, that three-way communication that I introduced, are ways to make sure that we are keeping everybody in the moment, keeping everybody situationally aware.
Thank you, Ron. And here's a question that, by the way, Dina is saying, yes, I'm HCI graduate from Carleton. And
Carleton.
And
Virginia, of course.
Yeah, his Bjorn from Norway, I believe, is commenting that in Norway, interviews with 100 CEOs done by PwC said that they're more afraid of cyber attack than afraid of the pandemic. There you go.
So could we, well, okay, but back to the point, if we had the tools to respond, I mean, the pandemic, well, we fudged a few things, but we had a year plus to figure out how to respond, and we had tools. In some cases, we had to, of course, invent them, vaccines. We had to manufacture more than we had available, but we were able to respond to that. If we kind of leave our operators out there in a world where they have no means of recourse, no means of responding, I would think that would be a very frightening situation. If we can actually give them the tools to recognize and respond, it's not such a frightening thing.
Next question is very dear to my heart. It deals with AI. So the question from Dick, great talk, Dr. Boring. What was the role of AI and machine learning? How did the system know how to tell the user what to do in response to an attack or steps of fixing the problem? And we recognize that you're talking about something that's in development. You're starting to introduce that, but we're curious to learn more.
Okay, so the original COSS system, I believe that's what you're referring to there. So that actually used something called ProDiag, which comes out of Argonne National Laboratory in Chicago. ProDiag uses convergence equations, so it's actually more of a change detection system. It's not a learning system. It's more of a change detection system that's paired to an expert system that has some predefined courses of action. We have not implemented that yet, a variant of that with machine learning. So again, the pattern recognition, that is the hallmark of machine learning. And so pairing that, using that to instead of this hard-coded convergence equation is where we want to go. One of the challenges we have in nuclear is we don't like black boxes. So there has been some hesitancy to embracing some technologies that we can't see through. It's a lot easier to trace if-then statements in computer code than a deep neural network. So we've demonstrated it with what I would say a fully transparent technology. If we can demonstrate that machine learning does the same thing, hopefully we can get some buy-in.
Thank you, Ron. Message from Bjorn, and I'm just gonna translate this to you, but not ask you to talk about it. Bjorn is saying, we ran the case attack on the turbine control in the research laboratories in Halden, Norway. The result in a simulator was the operators decided to shut down the reactor. What plans of collaboration with Halden do you at INL have? So I'm just gonna leave you to communicate further on that.
Bjorn, we will communicate.
That's right.
We are partners in Halden, so we work with Halden. So,
so here's we're getting close to a 60-minute limit. I'll try to hurry up. Dick is saying, when operators saw anomalous behavior in the system, what was their strategy to ascertain whether it was related to a system health issue compared with a cyber attack? What was their strategy to distinguish a certain between the two?
Right. So part of this is, again, we were not instructing them that these were cyber attacks until after the fact. So in debriefing, one of the things I mentioned this three-way communication, and so one of the things that happens when they encounter an unusual situation is they'll do a break. So they don't, unless there's something very critical, they will actually take a break, crew brief, they'll raise their hands, have a crew brief, and they'll discuss what's going on. And so you get this team expertise going, that doesn't make sense. Okay, try this, verify this. There's a lot of redundant indicators as well, whether it's a digital control room or an analog control room. So they then go in and they check other indicators to see what's going on. And it comes down to how much we've spoofed it. The study we haven't run is where we've varied the level of spoofing to see, is there a breaking point where this fails, this expertise fails? And then what could we do to help them see through that?
Thanks, Ron. Aino from Sweden is saying hi. Is saying also you recognized some regulation. It says you recognize some regulations and standards as driving forces to acknowledge these issues. What's your view? Is there more for the regulators to do in order to raise the human factor side? I'm guessing awareness of these issues.
Absolutely. Again, the regulator, I think, has been very proactive in the US, at least. I'm most familiar with that regulatory body. So acknowledging cyber, but not, I think the challenge has been allowing new digital technologies in without introducing additional vulnerabilities. And so I think if we go to this model that sometimes intrusions will happen, the regulator is poised to be the one to address the role of the operator in that position. So do we need additional technology? The regulator often sets the stage for research where we have gaps in our knowledge. I think we do have gaps in this area.
So we have a couple of more questions. I'll try to combine these two into one. One is addressing anticipation of cyber intrusion, creating mental models in partnership with operators and supervisor to help predict vulnerability. And the other one is in a world where we empower people to become active members in security, what ethical issues will need to be brought up. So mental models and ethical issues.
Okay, not sure about the question on the mental models. I missed the question part there. The ethical issues, again, a big area. We can't address that in 1 minute here. But you are opening up a new role. Are there the ethical issues concerned? Are there negative consequences of empowering the operator? Is it a burden to the operator? Does it introduce additional risks? Does it introduce compromises? All of those to be determined.
Thank you, Ron. And we're coming to an end of the hour of very, very exciting presentation. The questions keep on coming, keep on pouring, I will say. Unfortunately, we have to stop here. One of the questions that I will use to close this great discussion is, what are your future plans for research within areas you have covered, and maybe give us a little bit of a vision where the research is going to go in years to come?
Well, I think the challenge when you come in and you say, I'm not working in the Holy Trinity areas, is funding is sporadic. So my goal is to work with Virginia and Halden to actually realize some of these research projects. I think we've had some glimmers of some really interesting insights, but we need more. I can only do what I'm funded to do. Same story as everybody. We continue to look at this when we do studies. We continue to piggyback efforts, but it would be nice to get this as a focal area.
Well, we're all looking forward to talking more and working with you in the future. Thank you very much for this great talk. For the questions that continue coming, I would encourage them to contact you and continue this discussion via email. This was the fourth and last talk on our spring CCI series on human side of cybersecurity. Thank you very much all for attending, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much, Ron.
Thank you all. Thanks for the discussion. Very good discussion.